Parshas Tazria, what does it end with? The last word in Parshas Tazria. Anyone remembers? Zos toiras negat saras. Doesn't sound so good. בגד הצמר או הפשטים או השתי או ערב או כל כלי או לטהרו או לטמאו. Tuma, that's how you end the parsha. Parshas Metzora. What does it end with? ולאיש אשר ישכב עם טמא. הפטרה. פרשת מצורע. וירמסו עושו העם בשער וימוס. They trampled over him and he died. That's three things that end not such a good note. The Rema writes, Shulchan Aruch Chaim Siman Kuf Lamed Ches Seif Aleph, that you have to start with something good and you have to end on a positive note. How can it be? We just mentioned three things that end on a negative note. There's more. Parshas Noach. How does it end? Vayamos terach becharan. Parshas Vayikra. How does it end? Le'ashmava. One may commit a sin incurring guilt through it. Beautiful. Parshas Kedoshim. Next week. Yirgemu osam demeyam bam. Skila. Parshas Bamidbar. Kevala is HaKodesh v'amesu. Don't see what you're not supposed to see if you're a Kohen. Capital punishment. Parshas Balak. And 24,000 people died in the Magefa, in the plague. Such beautiful things you're ending with. Mamish what the Rema says. Only end on a positive note. What's going on here? There's too many parshas to say it's a mistake. It's a coincidence. Too many parshas. The end of the Torah. Parshas is like Habrahca. How does it end? Le'einei kol Yisrael. Rashi. What is it referring to that everybody saw? The smashing of the luchos. That's not so positive. Moshe Rabbeinu took the luchos HaKadosh Baruch Hu made and he said, nah, he broke them. More than that. Some Rishonim, Sefer HaChinuch for example, he breaks up Parshas Mishpatim and he says, don't say Parshas Mishpatim for the entire Parsha that we have. He actually breaks it in two. There's two Parshas. So the first Parsha, Parshas Mishpatim, how does it end? Based on his chiluk. Vayu neshechem almanos, and your wives will be widows, ubenechem, and your sons, yesomim, orphans. Oh, such beautiful promises. Mamash gewaldig. Comes the Ben Ish Chai, and Rav Pe'alim, Chelek Dalet, Orach Chaim, Siman Mem Beis, and he says, Achidish, when the Rema says that you should always end on a positive note, you know what that ending point is? The guy who got an Aliyah, he says a bracha. Birkos HaTorah. That's how we end. Mimela, there's no shayla. Based on that, he says, Achidish, one who says by himself at home, Shnai Mikra ve'echad Targum, if he gets to one of these parshas which end on a negative note, he should take another pasuk from the parsha, a good one, and throw it at the end in order not to end on a bad note. He says the same thing about this Haftarah, Parshas Metzora. Take another pasuk from the Haftarah, a good one, plug it at the end, so you don't finish, because you don't have a bracha when you say Shnai Mikra ve'echad Targum, and that's a tremendous chiddush. Shalosh Tshuvas Chayei Halevi Chelek Beis Simen Koyach Kafchet, he writes, based on this chiddush of the Rav Pe'alim of the Ben Ish Chai, now I understand, he writes, why in many places they're not choishish, and people stop in all kinds of places, whether it's bad when it ends or it's bad when it starts, and people don't worry. Why? Because anyways at the end a guy is going to say a bracha. Once he says a bracha, that's considered the ending point, and in Mele it's not a shayla. But Shalosh Tshuvas Mishnah Halachos challenges the Rav Pe'alim. He says, how is this possible? The Rema in Siman Kuf Lamed Ches, which we just quoted, is saying, make sure you end on a positive note, is speaking about Kriyas HaTorah B'tzibur. The Rema didn't know that every time after a person gets an aliyah, he says a bracha? And yet the Rema says, make sure that you end on a positive note. So it must be that the Rema was not talking about the person who got an aliyah, and therefore the Mishnah Halachos doesn't understand the Ben Ish Chai. The question itself, why is it that there are some parshos that end on what seems to us not to be so positive? Says Shalosh Tshuvas Chayei Halevi, and the Haggaos Maharsham in Moed Katan Kuf Ches, Kaf Ches Amud Beis writes similarly. The entire Torah is actually names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Ramban already writes this in the Hakdama to his Torah, and it's already mefurish in the Zohar HaKodesh. The entire Torah, 304,000 letters, 805, are actually combinations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's names. Everything is good, loaded and saturated with blessings. And therefore there's no problem where you stop. Now if you decide to make a stop not where they instructed you, so to our eyes, certain things look negative, make sure you don't stop there. But if the Kadmonim told you to stop in a certain Sheni, Shlishi, Revi, Shvi, or whatever it is, that point, even though it seems to you negative, is actually a blessing. And therefore he says there's no problem to stop no matter where you are. But when you decide to make a stop, follow what the Rema says. The Maor Vashemesh brings an unbelievable minhag that he used to have. Minhag HaKadmonim, he writes, that the end of Parshas Vayikra, that we said ends with the words Le'ashma Va, guilt. There was a minhag that the entire tzibur, when you finish reading, they all stand up and they yell, Lakel asher shavas mikol ha'maisim bayom hashvi, Rashi Tevos, le'ashma va, in order to end on a positive note and not on a negative. And that's a tremendous chiddush. Shaul's Juvis, Mishneh Halachos, back to him again, Chelek Vav and Simon Lamed Beis. He writes two different ways. Why is it that some parshas, as we quoted, don't seem to end on a positive note? First of all, he brings the Magen Avraham in Kuf Lamed Ches Seif Kotten Dalet, and the Mishnah Berurah brings him in Seif Kotten Hey, that if it's something bad that happens to the Goyim, it's not considered bad. And that's why he answers Parshas Noach. Vayamos terach becharan, and he died in Haran. Okay, so what happened? He's not a Yid, as far as we know. There are no Yids. No Yidins in the world at that point. Ra'as hagoyim, bad things that happen to them, is not considered a bad thing. There's no problem. The other thing he says, this is not me'ikar adin. It's a good eitzah. And why is it? Sometimes in the Torah there's all kinds of things that the Baal Koreh writes, he reads out loud, and the guy getting Aliyah may think that he actually means that this should happen to you, because yesterday they had a major argument or a fight, I don't know what. So the guy gets Aliyah and says, uh-oh, the guy's cursing me. So make sure you don't end on a negative note. So he says this only applies when you're speaking beyachid to the person near you. But b'lashon nistar, not relevant. For example, what we quoted, Parshas Kedoshim. Ish or isha, man or woman, if they do a certain thing, d'meihem bam. It's not talking about this guy standing right next to me. Parshas Balak, there was a Magefa, 24,000 people died. I'm telling you a story. You know, back then there was a plague, 24,000 people died. It's nothing to do with the guy standing right next to me. There's no problem. Parshas Bamidbar, certain Kohanim, if they do a certain thing, it's wrong. What does it have to do with the guy standing next to me? In Mele, he says it's not a problem. Shaul's Juvis Yosef Ometz, who is the Chida, he writes a big Chiddush. This whole thing only applies not to the Baal Koreh. If it so happens that the guy who got an Aliyah is actually also going to lane, that used to be the minhag, so then he should make sure not to stop at a negative note. Don't end on a negative note, but the Baal Koreh, it's not relevant to him. So the Mefarshim write all kinds of things that even those things that seem to us very, very negative, positive spin, and just try to switch things around. But, lemaise, when there's a chiyuv in town, there's a simcha. Bar mitzvah, wedding, whatever it is, and you want to add more people, very important guests, and you must add more chiyuvim. Lemaise, one can be mekel and can stop at things which don't seem to be so good. And you should start with something which is positive if you can. And if you can't, you can't. The kpeida, and everybody is makpid on not to do this in the middle of the toichecha, in the middle of the rebuke, in Parshas Bechukoisai, Parshas Kisavo, that no one stops. That's from the Kadmonim, but in other areas, if there's a chiyuv, one can be mekel. It's important to note, very interesting, that this kpeida, to end on a good note, is not just when you're reading in the Torah, b'tzibur, in shul. It's even when you're reading by yourself, you're reading a chapter in the Navi. Make sure you end on a positive note. And in Minhagi Achsam Sofer, it's brought that he was bimakpid even in divrei chulin, not matters of kedusha, when you're reading a pasuk, to make sure you never end on a negative note.